Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the sixth and final talk of the 2023 Dardalis Hellenic Archives Research Seminar Series. My name is Stephanie Kaloudis, and I'm from La Trobe University's Greek Studies program. On behalf of the Greek Studies program at La Trobe, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we've gathered tonight, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the long-term benefactor of the Greek Studies program, the late Mr. Anastasios Vassilogiannis, all recent donors, and the major original benefactor associated with the archives, Mr. Zisis Dardalis, who sadly passed away in March this year. Through this series of talks, we're able to honour the memory and the legacy of Mr. Dardalis. The Greek Studies program would like to thank both the Dardalis Archives of the Hellenic Diaspora at La Trobe and the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria for accepting our invitation to jointly present this second series of talks. And in particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Nick Dallas, Kostas Avlonitis, Heidi Serafimidou, and all the other team members for their organisational and technical assistance. I'd like to thank our speakers this year, George Pangalis, Sotiris Hadjimanolis, Professor Joy Damusi, Rena Fragoudaki and Panos Apostolou, Panagiotis Yanoudis, and tonight's speaker, Dr. Alex Delios. I would like to note that 3 out of our 6 talks this year were presented in Greek, and I hope that demonstrates our commitment to supporting the continued use of the language in Australia. And this ties in actually with the work of Pharos. Pharos, you can read about Pharos in the pamphlets on your seats. Pharos is a broad-based alliance made up of all sorts of groups and individuals, educators, businesses, community organisations, including the Kinotita, the Archdiocese, lots of Greek schools, La Trobe's Greek program, groups and individuals, as I said, all working together to revitalise the teaching and the use of the Greek language in Victoria and Australia. And we have a very important seminar coming up on Sunday here at 2:30 to be hosted by Pharos facilitator, Professor Joseph Lobianco. So anybody with young children, please come along if you can. Pharos has been doing a lot of work trying to promote Greek language use in the home and beyond the home, chaired by the Modern Greek Teachers Association of Victoria, and we've got lots of interesting activities to come. I'd also like to take this opportunity, since it is our final talk, to thank all the media outlets for promoting the series this year. So 3ZZZ Greek Radio, SBS Greek Radio, Omogenia TV, the Greek Herald, Neos Cosmos, and of course we'd like to thank all of you for supporting the initiative by attending. On a personal note, I'd like to thank my colleague Dr. Dimitris Gonis, who's here tonight, and our students who've made it despite it being exam period. I'd also like to thank Michael Protopapa for all his assistance in putting together both series of seminars, both back in 2019 and this year's seminar series. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you, Michael, and I thank you for your support, your guidance, and all your hard work behind the scenes. This series is titled The History of the Greeks in Australia in 6 Objects, and it aims to bring together academics, students, and members of the public to explore the variety of Greek-Australian migration stories contained in the Dardalis Archives of the Hellenic Diaspora. So in this way, it achieves 3 strategic goals of the university: education, research, and community engagement. The archives are a unique resource of national and international significance. They contain a plethora of objects, photos, books, correspondence, films, cinematic equipment, and more. donated by the local Greek Australian community, and all these objects reflect the migration of Greeks to Australia. Our aim has been to explore the Greek Australian experience through the contents of the collection. And to that end, we've asked all our speakers to select an item from the archives as a starting point for their presentations. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Alexandra Delios. She's a historian and a senior lecturer at the Centre for Heritage and Museum Studies at the Australian National University in Canberra. Her research considers the public and oral history of migrant and refugee communities, their experiences of settlement and working and family life. She has published on child migration, popular representations of multiculturalism, immigration centres and hostels, the intersections of migrant industrial and labour heritage, public history practices and cultural heritage management in Australia. I first came across Alex's work several years ago when we introduced a new culture subject at La Trobe that examined the Greek contribution to multiculturalism in Australia. And Alex's research on Bonegilla, especially her book Histories of Controversy, Bonegilla Migrant Centre, published in 2017, was set as required reading. I was struck by her methodical approach, her attention to detail, and also the care with which she went about recording the collective and individual histories. I remember thinking at the time that we really ought to find a way to have her take a look at the Dardalis Archives. She had actually gotten in touch with us and she was organising a visit with Michael, and it was just before COVID when everything had to then be put on hold. But she is here with us tonight, and we thank her for accepting our invitation to be a part of this initiative. It's wonderful to be able to actually close this series with a talk on an organisation that is so important to our community and that celebrated actually its 50th anniversary last year. Alex's talk is titled Tracking Welfare Debates in the Dardalis Archives, a Snapshot, Women and Families and the Australian Greek Welfare Society, also known as PRONIA. Please let's all make Alex welcome.
Thank you, Steffi, for your lovely words. I also want to add on my acknowledgements to the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So, as I kind of outlined in my abstract, this paper was prompted by a fairly innocuous document that I found in the Dardalis Archives, a long list of the mostly female volunteers for the Australian Greek Welfare Society from 1997, and an account of the welfare unit's work in helping women and families over that year, much of it facilitated through volunteer labour. I note that some who worked as volunteers in the early 70s, also listed here, went on to work as well as paid welfare officers by the late 1970s. The committee too, as we'll see, became more diversified in its board of directors, as well as kind of diversifying its separate arms, its finance unit, its welfare unit by the late 1990s, which isn't shown in this particular photo. Since the early 70s, the Australian Greek Welfare Society, which I'll just say Welfare Society from now on, offered direct social service delivery, community education, community development work, and policy development in conjunction with government programs and grants for primarily Greek-speaking populations in Melbourne. It also made contributions to policy debates and public discussions about multiculturalism and the nature of social welfare in Australia. Greek Australian women, in particular, played a key role in these debates and in the direct social service delivery, working at the front lines, as it were. So the Dardalis Archives contains documents that also attest to their work and its impact. So this evening, I'm going to explore firstly why and how these archival materials pertaining to the Welfare Society and other welfare efforts are historically important, And secondly, what kind of histories we can tell with them and whose voices they contain, and how to bring out those voices more fully. At the very least, these documents enable researchers to track the nature of ethnic welfare debates as they developed right up until the present day. If we take the Greek-speaking community in Melbourne as a case study, and one that intersects with the interests and structures affecting other ethnic minority groups in Australia. First of all, who was the Welfare Society? So before the policy transition away from assimilation in the 1960s, becoming Australian meant shedding outwardly ethnic markers, language being the first, adopting citizenship as soon as possible. Crucially, it also meant little to no targeted and culturally appropriate social services, including welfare and education for ethnic and other migrant communities. So community groups naturally stepped in to fill these gaps. The Welfare Society was launched in 1972 in Melbourne, headed by a number of migrant background multicultural activists and lawyers, namely George Papadopoulos as chairman, Dr. Spiro Moraitis as president, and Dr. Eugenia Mitrakis as secretary, with help from the Greek Professionals Association, formed by Mitrakis, and activist friends in the Centre for Urban Research and Action in Fitzroy. The Welfare Society were able to launch. So the political environment in the late 60s and 70s, including the election of the Whitlam government and that discourse around social justice, community participation, and a new embrace of difference that underpinned it, also aided their emergence as an ethnic welfare and lobby group. While they primarily helped Greek-speaking migrants, they recognised as well the need for an allied ethnic voice to power, as they termed it. In the early 70s, they, alongside other migrant background activists, worked as union officials. They represented this emergence of a more assertive migrant voice. Many of them were tertiary educated in Australia, particularly as we get into the 80s and the 90s, when their efforts were boosted again by a further generation of university-educated Greek-speaking Greek Australians. All of this is to say that their committee members, containing lawyers, medical practitioners and trained welfare workers, were part of a network that collaborated with ecumenical charities and new urban research centres like the Ecumenical Migration Centre, the EMC in Richmond, or the formerly mentioned Centre for Urban Research and Action, or CURA, in Fitzroy, as well as other ethnic community groups like the Australian branch of the communist-supported Italian Federation of Migrant Workers and their families, or FILEF, and other migrant background trade unionists. So this was a diverse network, if we are to try and unpack what was the migrant rights movement of that era. As stated, the Welfare Society started with a small committee of 10. They were supported by an additional 10 volunteers. Most of the volunteers were women. Most of the committee, with the exception of Secretary Eugenia Mitrakis, who drafted the first constitution as a young lawyer, most of them were men. Initially, they were housed in a small office with limited opening hours. By the mid-1970s, most of their operations occurred out of their Richmond building in Melbourne's inner east. By 1974, they employed both social workers and welfare rights officers, including Rita Packer and Celeste Dufus, with funding from the Department of Social Security's Welfare Rights Officer Scheme, which was a scheme that directed some of its funds to ethnic community groups. According to Papadopoulos, the first chairman, writing in the second edition of the Welfare Society's publication, the Greek Action Bulletin, in 1974, the Welfare Society was formed, and I quote, because of the obvious fact that existing Australian welfare agencies were not at the time and as yet not able to effectively deliver to ethnic communities any appropriate services. In addition to facilitating the delivery of services, they also acted as a research and advocacy organisation. So they were a multi-purpose centre that hoped to, and I quote again from Moraitis, be a source for the emanation of ideas, mobilising knowledge to challenge government, both state and federal, and call for a fair distribution of economic resources and legal and social recognition of ethnic difference. Their members conducted and published studies on the experience and understanding of Greek-speaking as well as other non-English-speaking migrants, particularly in the industrial workforce. The research from the Society tracked migrant people's engagements with welfare and health systems, the legal system, and other government departments. And with this research, they aimed to, and I quote, educate and sensitise Australian society to ethnic problems, needs and solutions. Politically, and especially in the early 70s when they formed, many individual committee members had close ties with the Victorian Labor Party. But unlike the Greek Workers' Leagues, the Democratist League, they did not align themselves with the Communist Party of Australia or any one political party. In this way, they were successful lobbyists, eventually willing to work with any political party and directly lobbying individual MPs and governments. Their desire to challenge the practices and attitudes of government departments, politicians, industry, trade unions, as well as the medical and legal professions, were shaped by social justice aims, but also by their professional backgrounds in welfare work, law, and healthcare. So they had enduring engagements through their medical, legal, and social work with local communities, as I'll outline. And they were able to draw on these professional connections to make their case for change. That said, their clients, the day-to-day inquiries they received and whom their welfare unit were responding to were, and I quote again from the Greek Action Bulletin, the ethnicised proletariat. The welfare unit of the Welfare Society came to dominate its operations by the early 1980s and then to engage more heavily in client services, particularly in the fields of childcare and aged care. And of course today the Welfare Society is known as Pronia. So why are these archives important? Why are the records of the Welfare Society, those annual reports, even the photographs and recordings held by the Dardalis Archives important? Well, the bulletins, the meeting minutes, the annual reports, as I've said, and other records, particularly the Greek Action Bulletin, which was published primarily in English with some Greek articles, constitute key sources in the history of debates about multiculturalism and welfare rights. In 1978, the sociologist Jean Martin argued that the advocacy of the Welfare Society represented the most sustained effort in the promotion of ethnic rights at this time, and she stressed the importance of the Greek Action Bulletin in particular. That bulletin contained papers by Welfare Society committee members, as well as occasional papers by prominent migrant background trade unionists, other migrant rights activists working in ecumenical charities, and visiting academics. Along with the bulletin, their papers, public reports, and meeting minutes are archived and accessible, but they have not been drawn upon in histories of multiculturalism and migration in Australia. Although I note that only last year, and during that anniversary, Professor Joy DeMusi wrote the commissioned history of the Welfare Society. But again, most of the Australian Greek Welfare Society material that I've been able to access is contained within the National Library manuscript collection of Margaret and Spiro Moraitis, as well as, of course, the material contained at the Dardalis Archives. So I've just tried to outline here a couple of the reasons why I think these sources are important to the stories, the histories that I'm trying to explore, aside from obviously the value of community record keeping, understanding community practices and engagements with social policy and social service delivery, obviously insights into the internal dynamics of a community as well as external, I'm thinking more political and state-based pressures, as well as the involvement and work of volunteers, which I'll get to. Ultimately, I see these sources as contributing to what I've called a new history of welfare, that third sector, as well as volunteerism in Australia. Existing histories largely ignore ethnic diversity and changes to services that were necessitated by multiculturalism since the 70s. So I'm consulting these archives with a particular question in mind. How do we understand this work from the perspective of welfare workers and volunteers on the ground? So today I'm not necessarily focusing on the advocacy or the lobbying, of which the Welfare Society did a lot, or how its more prominent professional members worked with the state and governments in advocacy and lobbying on behalf of migrant workers, or even on issues of major legal reform. I note that Australian Welfare Committee member Eugenia Mitrakis was very important in terms of legal reform, in terms of education reform. Stan Paparoglou also played a role. But today I think I might just turn to specific client services and programs, particularly those that emerged in the late 70s. So these are examples of community initiatives and services and the experience of volunteers. So my project has started in the 70s. I'm hoping to eventually move beyond the 70s, but I'm obviously eager to speak to those who are involved in welfare advocacy beyond this period. Of course, much of the Dardalis material pertaining to the Welfare Society kind of begins from the 90s, as I indicated in my first slide, and extends into the 2000s when the archive was established. So this is a snapshot that I've focused on from 1977 in terms of client services and volunteers, activities in the welfare unit that kind of spread across a number of suburbs in Melbourne, Prahran, Richmond, Fitzroy, a lot of them focusing around not just one-off client services, direct client services, but community development work and long-term community development work, particularly around youth, childcare, but also elderly citizens and, of course, legal aid and family law. I've listed at the bottom there as well some specific social programs and services that emerged in 1977 and the individual members behind those initiatives, childcare cooperatives, an isolated mothers group, elderly corners. All of these are kind of regular meeting groups that were very important to the social and psychological needs of community members. On the point of community development work, by the 60s and 70s, more broadly, these ideas concerning community development and empowerment underpinned a lot of social work theory, with a shifting focus from secondary intervention towards the prevention of social welfare problems through things like community development programs. And I think that's important in understanding what's going on here and the sort of context for the 70s and the real kind of explosion in this community development work. In my previous talk, I mentioned a lot of work from social worker Lula Rodopoulos, who was also an academic, and she traced some of these evolutions and their implications for ethnic communities in 1970s Australia. So the family issues that arise in the migrant setting, she links to the dilemmas of a bicultural setting, particularly in matters like culturally laden and difficult matters like abortion, family planning, the raising of children, generational conflict in the home. She explored the difficulties that a Greek social worker in that period, in the 70s, paid or volunteer, could encounter in trying to balance different attitudes and values in a bicultural, multicultural setting. While she argued for broad and specific training, she noted that, and I quote, "most of this assistance remains at a voluntary level." She argued that there was much to be done by the host community to alleviate the issues faced by migrant families, to alleviate social pressures, including a need for general services to be improved in a way that different cultural attitudes are reflected in mainstream services. Other reports from the early to mid-80s, like those from the Australian Institute of Multicultural Affairs, give a similar picture of the welfare sector, arguing that the limited financial means and reliance on volunteers of ethnic community organisations is something that policymakers need to be aware of. And I quote, "Community leaders often feel too much is expected of them, both by government and their own communities." The Institute of Multicultural Affairs consultation with ethnic community organisations involved in welfare provision found that older established communities are often as disadvantaged as smaller, newer ones. The lack of services for migrants in the past has meant that older established groups, including Southern European groups, including Greek-speaking communities, rely more on internal supports rather than explore what may be available to the general public through various programs and services in the mainstream. The report continues that the method of helping members, including pensioners, for example, unable to pay bills, is to, and I quote, "pass the hat around." And a lot of these kind of informal grassroots practices persisted right up until today. Dardalis also cited class, education, and attitudinal differences as shaping the dynamic between community members in need and social workers and volunteers from community organisations. She cited, in one example at least, the expectation that the social worker act a certain way. She cites as an example the expectation that the Greek social worker be there to tell the victimised wife, daughter, to go back home, for example, although these expectations were by no means limited to non-Anglo-Celtic cohorts. All of this is to say that staff and volunteers at the Greek Welfare Society navigated complex needs and attitudes in a system that didn't always account for linguistic and cultural difference or properly fund welfare services across the board. And the Welfare Society needed a great deal of sensitivity to gain the trust and support of migrant communities in Melbourne, which obviously they needed in order to survive. Some cases, as annual reports state, required co-management too, between different units from within the Australian Greek Welfare Society and different programs, as well as with mainstream service providers, in order to ensure a comprehensive and holistic approach to case management, but also in matters of community development that I outlined earlier. This I just found kind of interesting, actually. It's an example of the hiring changes in the Welfare Society from the mid-1970s. So from 1975, the Welfare Society's monthly average case numbers increased from 180 a month to 360. Over 3,000 individual cases a year, and that figure remained stable well into the 1990s. So they mainly offered one-on-one counselling for individuals and families. Annual reports noted that an increasing number of migrant background people were requesting help with things like family counselling, pensions, sickness, invalid, aged, special benefits and widows' pensions, employment seeking, legal aid, housing, financial assistance, and of course help dealing with the Department of Immigration. The annual reports and bulletins also note the increase in complex long-term cases. The casework was becoming, to quote a 1975 report, far more complex and time-consuming, with staff engaged in complex problems relating to family counselling, financial troubles and lengthy legal disputes, particularly when it came to workers' compensation claims. So this saw social workers engaging with individuals and family groups for months, sometimes years, and included extensive liaising with government departments, as I mentioned, and other organisations. The increased demand in the form of long-term complex cases, many of them by their nature requiring home or institution visits, could not be fulfilled by the two welfare officers, by Dufas and Packer alone. And so a lot of volunteers, including people like Anna Matthews, provided voluntary outside visits to migrants in need, visiting them in their homes. And at the time, the Welfare Society argued that voluntary community organisations like theirs were best placed to participate in local social development programs and welfare planning, and in the assessment of their own needs. They made a point of accepting volunteers who were once clients, as it says here, because most of the Australian Greek Welfare Society employees and volunteers have suffered under the present social system, whether it be the Department of Social Security, the Housing Commission, or the Immigration Department. And I'll keep quoting for this because I think it's worth it. Having suffered, they understand from personal experience the harassment and frustrations which may occur when one is disadvantaged through ill health, unemployment, estrangement, or loneliness. They argue that they were closer to the communities they served than government officials or departments could ever be, which was also a vantage point they used in their lobbying and advocacy for community distributed funds for welfare services. In the mid to late 70s, the Welfare Society were successful in receiving several grants from the Department of Immigration and the Department of Social Security, which allowed them to appoint 2 detached youth workers and a childcare catalyst. I don't really know what a childcare catalyst is, but if you know, please tell me. And to pursue their aspirations in multilingual childcare and aged care, and campaigns for migrant education. So they progressively expanded their welfare staff as well as their volunteers over this time. However, despite this and other positive developments in the new infrastructure of multiculturalism, things like the Health Interpreter Service in 1977, the continued economic squeeze to welfare agencies, as well as broader attacks on several key tenets of the welfare state, adversely affected their ability to meet community demands. So the demand and their client numbers never decreased, if anything, they increased. Ethnic organisations had increased their demands over the 70s and 80s, that is, for funding from state and federal governments, but they remained under-resourced and under extreme pressure. So those community organisations operating primarily on volunteer labour, like the Greek Welfare Society, continued to fill gaps in ethnic service delivery throughout the 80s and into the 90s, as well as the reversal of the manufacturing sector in Australia was to hit migrant communities, particularly Southern European migrant communities, quite hard. So my second snapshot, focusing in particular on women and families and reforming medical and legal practices. Many of the Greek Australian women mentioned in the annual reports as welfare workers or volunteers didn't become presidents of these organisations, but they were busy working at the front lines of service delivery or campaigning for more equitable and culturally appropriate services and representative forms of local governance. Even those women who did obtain positions of power and in their professions faced barriers to their advocacy work, especially if they were challenging patriarchal systems of governance. Vula Messimeri Kianidis, who was director of the Welfare Society from 1989, as well as president of the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils from 2005, considered that much of the frontline work was undertaken by women and volunteers, which isn't accounted for in the official archive. I'm talking about in perhaps more elite institutions. I'm thinking of oral history collections at the National Library of Australia, for example. Needless to say, doing this type of family and community work is difficult, time-consuming, and often thankless. And this can include the field of family law. And Mitrakis, as a solicitor in South Melbourne and the only Greek lawyer in the area, dealt with workers' compensation and personal injury cases, which could, of course, involve family law matters. She speaks in this particular interview about how risky family work was in such a close-knit community, and how dangerous it could become for a woman in that space, and the threats that she received. at least one other Greek-speaking welfare officer I interviewed, this time in Sydney, vividly recounted to me similar threats of violence against her from estranged partners, and others kind of resistant to, on one level, the interventions of the welfare state, and on another, of a professional woman into matters considered private. So those working at the coalface, as it's called, grappled with this resistance while offering assistance to migrant families, both within an Australian legal system that wasn't open to linguistic or cultural difference, and within the context of a mostly patriarchal and close-knit constellation of migrant community interests, factors that could further alienate vulnerable people. These women were pioneers in reforming interpreter services in courts and hospitals, and pushing for cultural competency in medical and legal settings in Australia from the 1970s. And I think there's a lot more research, particularly in the form of oral histories, that can be done around this topic. I want to end on this example of communicating rights to migrants. So this was a basic responsibility that the Greek Welfare Society took on through the role of their welfare rights officers. And the priority to create structured programs and support groups that provide information on entitlements and the rights of workers in particular remained a priority for the Australian Greek Welfare Society throughout their history. As I think I've indicated, Welfare Society members were not only social workers providing client services, they also tackled underlying structural issues in the welfare system, starting with the failure to teach, and this is a quote, the failure to teach the migrant how the system works and how they can receive their just rights. In 1976, the Welfare Society hosted a workshop called Ethnic Groups and Welfare, and this was attended by members, not just Greek-speaking community members, but people from the Ecumenical Migration Centre, from Cura, from the Jewish Welfare Society, from Turkish welfare groups, from the Italian Welfare Society, as well as from PhilF. And collectively, they endeavoured to work through the implications of changes to, in that context, health insurance. At the time, the National Scheme of Universal Health Insurance, what was then called Medibank, introduced in 1975, was being partially dismantled by the Fraser government. So these ethnic communities were very heavily involved in these debates and how they could communicate these changes and their implications to their community members. Other areas of funding that directly affected the migrant rights agenda was also under threat, including things like the Welfare Rights Officer Scheme that provided funding to hire people like Rita Packer, and the amount allocated to the Grant and Aid Scheme, which enabled them to hire social workers. In their role as welfare rights officers in the 70s, Celeste Dufas and Rita Packer spoke directly as well to politicians and the public service about the problems of migrants. They also consulted with other welfare agencies and, most importantly, created public forums and resources to communicate to migrants their rights. So they had a significant impact on the welfare rights agenda of the Australian Greek Welfare Society. Turning to a particular moment, we're still in the mid-1970s, and I'll quote here from a society bulletin in which they state that they were vexed, slightly angry and very concerned that a few members of the Public Service Department of Social Security were conducting a campaign against the Welfare Rights Officer Scheme. And they emphasised in the pages of the Greek Action Bulletin that this worthwhile community project allowed Dufas and Packer to spend 40 hours per week on welfare rights work, including ethnic broadcasting, lectures, talks, and casework in the rights of migrants. The overwhelming success of their weekly program on migrant rights, which was aired on public access radio, in this case 3ZZ, was very important for communicating information to local Greek speakers. And this program in particular was earmarked for praise. Quote, "Our office is inundated with telephone calls and clients who request more information on their rights following each radio program. Individual programs address the following issues: welfare rights as benefits and entitlements, home help schemes, legal aid, unemployment benefits. They also answered listener questions and queries about re-entry visas and applications for family immigration. The Australian Institute of Multicultural Affairs evaluation of post-arrival services, otherwise known as the Gold Valley Report, indicated that 75% of programs on the public access radio stations carried news, current affairs, and a substantial amount of community information. In one talkback radio program, they reported that practically all our callers had distorted ideas on what they were entitled to. There was also a fear that a change in nationality resulted from enormous financial loss. So despite the official pamphlets distributed by various government departments, migrants received much of their information from community radio and from Australian Greek Welfare Society rights officers who use this platform to fill gaps in communication. In the fight to retain funding for volunteer self-help welfare agencies, the Australian Greek Welfare Society made a submission to the 1976 Administrative Review Committee, which was then looking to curtail expenses. They reiterated that the welfare rights program in particular has helped people obtain their rights, and through media, especially ethnic broadcasting, the rights of people have been publicised. So communication was most effective, they argued, if channeled through community organisations. So that's where I'm at the moment in terms of the archival sources. Just thinking through as final thoughts about these sources, these collections and the voices they contain. Obviously more oral histories are needed, particularly with women, those who didn't always go on to become perhaps presidents of societies. Obviously digitising these records in the Dardalis would also help, and that is an ongoing process. In order to get a picture of how things developed, in this case in the welfare field, particularly into the 1990s and as the Aged and Disability Services Unit of the Greek Welfare Society expanded. We know from some of the reports and newsletters in the 1980s that for the welfare workers, short-term cases constituted a lot of their work, but long-term casework remained important, including the need for extensive liaising with government departments and various organisations on behalf of clients, as well as the need for home visits and family counselling. Research work as well as advocacy remained integral to the Welfare Society's work, including increasingly into Greek elderly groups across Melbourne and meeting the needs and aged services, which eventually saw the society pivot towards this area. I note too that despite the widespread assumption that the Greek-speaking communities of Melbourne were very well assimilated, integrated, socially mobile, the Australian Greek Welfare Society in the late 1990s was reporting with increasing concern on the issue of social isolation, particularly amongst the elderly. And in response, they created a social isolation program, which was to provide companionship and support to people in their homes. So this was a continuity of previous community development programs that had emerged in the early 70s. And this was run, again, with the help of the Australian Greek Welfare Society's volunteers, which had by that point reached 145 volunteers. And I've got up on the slides here just, well, on one side is some floppy disks, and of which I had no way of accessing. I don't know if anyone in this room is able to access a floppy disk anymore, but this is just a small snippet of some of the analogue material, which of course poses questions about accessibility, but also there are, not shown here, but hundreds of cassettes that may also contain some of the voices I'm searching for, but yeah, we'll get to that. I think I'll leave it there and open it up to questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Alex, for the quite enlightening sort of presentation. And I'm sure Costa's here at some stage could help you access those floppy disks. What do you reckon, Costa? There must be a way. If you can't do it, no one can. So, yeah. Any questions from the audience? Evgenia, maybe you can describe to us what a childcare catalyst is, because I think I saw you nodding your head before.
I was hit one time by about a year when the opened job. No.
Okay.
Make a comment on the social isolation. That still exists today, and it's a real problem in the first generation. I saw an old client of mine that's been a client all my professional life last Friday, and the son brought her in concerned that she'd taken in a boarder, in inverted commas, doesn't need the financial help from the boarder, and the son was really concerned that the boarder may be coming in to make a claim on her later on as alleging to have been the carer. And I sort of had a long interview with her and asked her, is she getting satisfaction? Does she want that woman? And what she kept telling me is it breaks the loneliness.
Yeah.
And it's still there today, even when they're affluent.
Can I ask something? Alex, do you think they were successful, or did they manage to reach out all the Greek community, like the Pronia, or they should be more organization like Pronia to provide services? Do you understand what I mean? I mean, maybe it was just one organization, and maybe the Greek community needed more organizations like this.
Like the Welfare Society.
Yeah.
I mean, they clearly filled a gap and met a need. Whether or not they met everyone's needs is a different story. I mean, they made a point of not coming out as in later years as explicitly aligned with any one political party, as I said, perhaps in order to get as many clients as they could. And their location within Richmond and now I think Brunswick is intentional in order to capture particularly that first generation of migrants. But is it enough? Is that kind of the question that you're asking? I would say no, but across the board, there would need to be mainstream changes to the way that social welfare workers are trained to meet diverse community needs. And I mean, a lot of these issues that I'm talking about still exist, and a lot of that comes down to kind of deeper structural issues, particularly around like the monolingualism of Australian multiculturalism. So.
And sorry. The other thing I wanted to ask you was, do you think the Australian government policy to let the ethnic communities deal with their problems was a good choice? I mean, so the Pronia took care of the Greeks. I don't know what the Italians did, or, I mean, do you think it was a good policy?
I mean, there are arguments for and against that I've come across, and particularly these debates in the 70s when the whole field of welfare was professionalising, and there was this fixation on being trained as a welfare worker, and kind of a dismissal of perhaps volunteer labour, upon which ethnic community organisations relied quite heavily. Whether or not like that sort of care should rely with communities or with state-based agencies is kind of something that we're still grappling with, and a lot of it comes down to state-based policies. It's not necessarily at the federal level Like Victoria is different from New South Wales again, and that goes back to like 19th century developments in welfare work and care. And the fact that they're kind of chronically underfunded by the state, right? And a lot of the more successful welfare initiatives kind of receive a lot of private donations as well, right? There's definitely arguments for kind of ethnic welfare workers having more kind of insider, intimate knowledge of their community's needs and being able to meet those needs. But at the same time, other social welfare workers who may have a migrant background argue that what needs to change is kind of Anglo-Australian training and practices.
I would say a large part is also a cost issue. It's like sort of language education as well, sort of pass responsibility off to the communities, rather than the government sort of funding it. So.
If I can make a comment that you mentioned the welfare was not really involved, aligning stuff with every party, although there were more Labor-oriented people on the executive. We had a really good rapport with Malcolm Fraser, and I remember about Malcolm Fraser coming in this very building to address us before we were incorporated in the early days. And then Malcolm Fraser, in one of his launch speeches I think it was 1977, gave the example of Greek welfare as an organisation who understands the needs of this society, and rather than having the people going to non-Greek speaking social workers, give them the money to do their own. And I think that was a good policy. For example, how could you get an Australian person coming in and dealing with clients that I had wanting to marry off a 15-year-old when the age for getting married was 18, and forcing me to go to court. And I said, I won't do it on this. I think you could go to court when they were 16 and seek the court's consent. And it's sort of, there's things that people couldn't understand. And I remember Constantino telling me that he had he's one of the doctors on the committee, original, and he was in Bridge Street Clinic in Port Melbourne, and he had a lot of the women going in there who had sexual experience before marriage, wanting to be sewn up so they could still be virgins because that was expected of them. And there's sort of issues that a non-Greek social worker and welfare officer really couldn't understand and wouldn't be able to do justice to the person.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many stories in the medical field in particular of that misunderstanding and the need for cultural competency. I think also, like your question, Juliana, about whose responsibility it should be, whether the state is abdicating responsibility for welfare to ethnic communities. I think in the 70s, the debate and the emergence of multiculturalism was all about kind of rejecting the patronising paternalism of the state. And that was really a part of kind of regaining kind of control of some of these issues. Yeah.
With Bronya and with what you've been talking about, does that all relate to Victoria or is it federal?
It's Victoria, yeah, pretty much.
So my next question was going to be, how does Victoria compare? How do the states all compare to each other, and which state is doing a better job, say, supposedly?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I've done some interviews with women in Sydney who worked in kind of New South Wales as in, I guess, what we can call migrant multicultural information and health centres. And it seems to me, this is my hypothesis from those interviews and consulting the sources, that in that case there was more of a movement not to funnel funds through ethnic community organisations, but rather to have ethnic welfare workers employed and working within state-based information and health centres. But again, a kind of direct comparison I've not yet done, but it's definitely worth looking into. I think also understanding the different demographics and nature of the communities is important in any comparison, as the Greek communities in Melbourne are different from those in Sydney or Adelaide or Brisbane. Yeah.
My understanding is that we've got about 200 employees at the moment, whereas I think Sydney has about 40, 50.
Yeah, that
So
doesn't
they're
surprise
different organisations.
Okay, any final questions? Okay, Alex, thanks for that sort of interesting history, and round of applause for our speaker tonight, and best of luck with your future research.